Hello, my name is Timothy G. from St. Andrews, Saratoga, and I have the pleasure of interviewing today uh, Rita Welsh from St. Thomas in Sunnyvale. Welcome, Rita.
Thank you. Thank you, Timothy.
Well, we're so glad that you agreed to share your story with us today. And first off, we'd like to know how long you've lived in the area.
I have lived in the area all of my life. My mother's family, side of the family, has been here in California for 5 generations. My father's side of the family started in Stockton, went to Hollister, and then to San Carlos. And on that side, they're third generation Californians. Since I've been here all my life and I'm over 70, I've had a lot of experience in this area. For when I was first born, it was during World War II and after the Japanese internment. So my first home was with my mother and father. It was in a Japanese gardenia farm. And we were there protecting the property and farming the gardenias while the other people, the owners, were interned. Um, and when they came back from internment, we went back to the family home, which was San Carlos, where my paternal grandmother's home was, and the house was built by all of her children from the ground up. After that, I moved to Palo Alto and grew up there and I was there until college. So in Palo Alto, my first friend was 3 blocks away. On the way I would walk to school and go to her house, and we would go across the street to grammar school together. And she was the only other Chinese person in our class. We still she lives in San Francisco, and we still see each other once a year. My long-term friends are my family. I grew up at first in my grandmother's house, and there were 2 families. So I grew up in a multi-generational home at first, and my family moved to Palo Alto. But every holiday we would get together with my father's relatives. They would invite to July 4th or whatever the holiday was. All of the siblings, all of their children, all of the in-laws, and as my father would say, all of the outlaws. So I was used to celebrating Christmas, New Year's, 4th of July with at least 75 people. And I knew them all my entire life. And the oldest generation is gone now. The top 2 generations above us are gone. So I'm in the oldest generation. And 7 of the female cousins on my father's side get together. We used to get together once a year and give our aunties a lunch, or either treat them to a restaurant or have them over to our house. And I miss that time, especially during COVID. We couldn't get together, but the aunties are gone, but us cousins, the 7 of us, still get together once a year.
That's great.
And 3 of us have been together at least almost once a week since the pandemic has started. We are on Zoom and we play Mahjong together. I grew up not knowing much about the Chinese character and about practices, and such as during Chinese New Year, Chinese people get together and they do certain things and they have certain rituals, and we didn't follow those. So I didn't know anything about it until I was in college, and a Chinese fellow I was dating told me about how his family celebrated Chinese New Year's. And I just knew that Chinese New Year's, my father would hand us a bunch of red packages, but we hadn't gone to visit other people in their homes, like I learned later was a custom.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I was probably in 10th grade, they started a Chinese school in Palo Alto. And I heard about it and I asked my mother if I could go to it because I wanted to learn Chinese. And she says, no, you can't do that.
You'd mentioned that your family pretty much grew up in the San Jose area. Could you talk about your family's growing up and being raised in San Jose, where they lived, where they moved eventually to San Carlos?
Okay, so it was my mother who grew up in San Jose. She was born and raised there, and so was her father. Um, so it's my great grandmother was born in San Francisco in the mid 1800s. She was a daughter of two Chinese acrobats who stayed in California for about 5 years. After 5 years, they left and went back to China. They gave her or adopted her out to a family in San Francisco, Chinatown, who had sons but no daughter. And um, she was raised by that family. Now, at that time, there were thousands of Chinese workers who had come over to work on the railroad and work on other things. And there were very few Chinese females. So my great grandmother was a prize. She was one of about 1,000 females out of hundreds of thousands of males. So she could pick and choose anybody she wanted to be her husband. And she did marry a rich, for that time, a rich merchant. He had farmland and he had a store. And eventually he had a dry goods store in Watsonville and in San Jose. And so they lived in San Jose after she was married. And they spent time in San Jose, then they moved to Watsonville, then they moved back to San Jose. And while this is all happening, 3 or 4 Chinatowns in San Jose were burned when the water wells were empty. So the fires didn't happen, but were deliberately set when there was no water available to put out the fires. And they settled in Highlineville, which was owned by a German man who I believe was kind to the Chinese immigrants because he was an immigrant himself, and he set up a place where they could live. And the Highlineville, where they lived, was near the present day Japantown now. It was enclosed with a fence so that at nighttime, after everybody returned home, the fence was closed and locked. And it was locked to keep people out, not to keep people away. So that Chinatown did not burn. That's the only Chinatown that was not burned in San Jose. When he died, the property was sold by his heirs, and my mother's family moved to Watsonville. So my father's family came first to Stockton, and my grandfather came with his twin and their family, his family, and then my grandfather's 2 sons and wife came, and at least one other brother came. And they were in Stockton. Then my grandfather moved to Hollister and worked for Ferry Morris Seed Company. And then the family moved to San Carlos, where he was still working for Ferry Morris Seed. And they had a farm in the wetlands of San Carlos. backing up a little bit, back to San Jose, when my grandfather and his brother were growing up in San Jose, they were not allowed to go to public school. So my grandfather, his brother, and their mother went to China when he was a teenager. And that was the first time my great grandmother had ever been in China. So they stayed at the family home, which I guess was pretty cushy for them. And my great uncle came back after a month, but my grandfather stayed there for 11 years, and he was educated. They found him a wife, and he came home with a wife and his mother. Uh, And she was the only daughter of a family, a pretty rich family.
Mm.
And she was used to a lot, but she contracted TB as soon as she came over here, and she died within a few years. So I never knew my maternal grandmother.
So was it your grandfather, they were not allowed to attend public schools. What schools did they attend then?
So my grandfather attended school in China, and he
Okay.
learned to read and write Chinese and English there. So when he came back, he was educated already. My great uncle, who went back to California after a short visit to China, went to Chinese school in San Francisco. And then when he was in about the 5th grade, he was allowed to go to public school at that time because the laws had changed.
You had mentioned to me previously that there was a school that was open in San Jose that was attended by students who were not allowed into regular public schools, but other minority groups attended. Do you?
Yes, I believe that was formed by a deacon from Trinity Cathedral, and that was formed after my grandfather and great uncle were of school age.
Okay.
So they weren't able to attend it, and it's wonderful that he did start that school.
When your family moved down to Watsonville, what did they face challenges in that community when they moved down there?
No, I really don't know what the challenges were there, but I think it was a more diverse community. There were they may have had people from Mexico working in the farms,
Okay.
and the land was more affordable. So my great grandfather was able to start a farm and a restaurant. And behind the restaurant, in the back door, if you go out the back door of the restaurant, you walked into the gambling hall. And that's how he made most of his money.
How do you relate to the terms immigrant, Asian, Asian American, and how do you think your parents or grandparents related to those terms?
Well, I like the name Asian American. It used to be Oriental or slang words that weren't very kind. So I like it, and I don't like it because it means that you're not all American. You're Asian, and then you're American. When I meet people for the first time, often when I meet people for the first time and they are Caucasian, they talk for a little while and then they ask me where I was born. Now, when I meet a Caucasian person or somebody else, I don't ask them where they were born. And to me, that means, well, you're not an American. Where are you from? So I have never been to Asia, and I don't know how to speak Chinese. And I'm offended when people ask me that question, and I try to not act like it, and I just answer the question simply, like, like I was born in Redwood City or San Mateo, wherever I was born.
And how do you think your parents, how did they,
Oh, I don't know. We never talked about that. We never talked about even the Japanese internment, which I really didn't understand because in our history classes, they never talked about it. I knew that these people had been in the camps, but I didn't even know what they were. Well, to go back a little bit, my mother grew up in San Jose, Chinatown, the Chinatown there. My father grew up in a Caucasian community. Growing up, his friends were the Japanese farmers and some Chinese farmers. So my mother's friends were all Chinese, and they were taught, just like the rest of the people, especially in California, to hate the Japanese, that they were terrible people. So when my sister started dating a very handsome Japanese guy in high school, my mother became very upset and told her not to date him, even though as friends, they had Japanese friends. I mean,
did you have much interaction with the Caucasian community there?
my mother might have in Watsonville, when she moved to Watsonville, because there was more of a mix of people. They weren't segregated. Well, there was some segregation, but they rented from a Caucasian lady who was very kind, and she only rented to Chinese people. Yeah, and Mrs. Kitchen, and she was very kind to everybody there.
So all these experiences, how did it shape your outlook on life, your choice of career, and how you interact with people?
Well, in the first place, I was always shy and really didn't reach out to people. People had to reach out to me. So I remained the same until I went to my second college. My first college I left because it was too much for me to be away from home and not, I wasn't ready anyway. So I went back again. And this time I went to San Jose State, and I chose social work for a major. And there was at that time a bachelor's in social work at San Jose State. A lot of the courses required some research papers, and I really glommed onto the Bracero program and the inequities there when I was writing the paper, and I did a lot of research on that. And actually, it was such a great paper. I used it in 3 different classes. It made me think about life and what people go through. But I didn't know, because I had a pretty privileged life, and I didn't have to worry about where I was going to sleep at night or what I was going to eat. So it did affect me a lot. So because I wanted to be a social worker, I applied when I graduated at the welfare department. So I went to work in Santa Clara County as an eligibility worker, and was there for 2 years until I switched to the probation department. So kind of my choice of careers changed, and the outlook I was hired by the adult probation department when it was separate, and their outlook on life was everybody needs to be punished. So that changed the way I thought about things for a while. And then when I could, 15 years later, I transferred to the juvenile division.
Did you face any challenges in working in that environment or in your career?
Yeah, actually, first of all, San Jose State opened my eyes because I had never seen so many different races all together. No, I first I was in San Carlos, then we moved to Palo Alto, and they were both totally white communities to me. And then in San Jose, there were all these different races and different peoples, and I just thought of them as people. I didn't think, oh, here's a black person, here's an Hispanic, but it felt very comfortable to me. And then when I worked at the welfare department, that was still the same. There was a lot of diversity there, except for the group that I went in with. It was, and they formed us into two units, one with all females and one male. And my unit was all male and me. And then when I went to adult probation, I was the seventh woman to be hired. So that diversity was more striking than the diversity of race. We were a minority. The women were a minority there. There were 7 and 75 or 6 men. And we were treated very roughly. Yeah.
In your career, did you encounter any racism or any either towards you or in your environment?
No, I don't think so, except for once, and I didn't recognize it. So I was over at Juvenile, where it was a very warm and affirming place to work. And I worked in the courts, taking cases to court in the court unit. And one of the fellows, I was wearing something, and I can't remember what I was wearing. And he said, "You look like a coolie." And then my friends, my women friends, took me aside and said, "You need to report him. That's a racist statement." And I said, so I didn't see that as racist, but I guess it was. So I reported him, and he had to take racial sensitivity classes, and he still talked to me. So, with a court system, I could see injustice a little bit in the way different people were treated. The people with the high-powered attorneys who could afford them had better treatment than the people who had to use the public defender or the minorities, And I did tell a judge once that I didn't think he was fair, that I felt that he treated this one kid who did a lot of damage, monetary damage to people's houses with a paintball gun. And he had these high-powered attorneys, and he was let out he was just let out of juvenile hall. And I spoke to him after the court hearing in chambers, and I said, I don't feel that was a fair thing that you did. If that kid would have been Hispanic or had a public defender, you wouldn't have let him go home. And he didn't say anything, but he didn't say anything bad to me, and he treated me fairly.
In what ways have you found the church to be a source of strength or a source of challenge?
From the very beginning, I felt the strength first from the picture of Jesus, and then my aunties, my one auntie gave me all of her daughters' books, and the most favorite book of mine was a Bible study, the Bible story book. In 7th grade, my friends took me to their church, and it was the Lutheran church, and I joined. And then after I joined, my family joined. My mother had grown up when she was in San Jose, going to the Methodist Episcopal Church in where Japantown is now. And they had a huge Chinese congregation there. And I'm backing up a little bit. My grandfather on my father's side used to ride his bike from Hollister to King City every Sunday because he was a deacon in the Methodist Church. So praying for the grandkids and the kids went back generations. Anyway, so the Methodist Church was the beginning, and then I joined the Lutheran Church, and then my family joined it, and I loved it. And I did everything there. I was confirmed there. We had 2 years of confirmation class once a week. I stopped going to church for about 15 years when I asked God to save my mother when she was dying. And then when God didn't save my mother, I was mad at God and stopped going, but I missed it. So 15 years later, when I met an Episcopal priest at a Christmas party, and he was talking about art. We were talking about art, which is one of my loves. And he said, "You've got to see the windows at Trinity. They're so beautiful, the stained glass windows." So I went there on a Sunday thinking I couldn't get in during the weekday. And I just fell in love with it. As soon as I sat down, I felt like I was home. And I went to the 8 o'clock service, and there was a Filipino family, and they welcomed me. And I thought, wow, there's Asians here. Because in the Lutheran Church, we were the only Chinese people, and they were all Scandinavian and really didn't look like me. So I loved it. And I was there for almost 30 years until I moved to Sunnyvale.
Well, Rita, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And your story is just very interesting. And we really appreciate your time
Thank you.
and sharing.
Thank you, Tim.